Hi, this is Carin Zissis of ASCOA Online.
Countries that are home to 4 billion people, half the world, are set to cast ballots in elections this calendar year.
More than half the global population is heading to the polls in a groundbreaking year of elections. The most
Año clave en las urnas para América Latina, que vivirá 6 elecciones presidenciales.
2024 será o maior ano eleitoral da história.
Una de ellas dos, Claudia Sheinbaum o Xochitl Gálvez, será la primera presidenta de México.
We want to thank the great people of Iowa. Thank you. We love you all.
2024 is a big year for Latin American voters, from presidential contests in several countries, including Mexico, Panama, and Uruguay, to local races in Brazil and Chile. If you're a Latin American, chances are you'll get to cast a ballot this year. We here at Latin American Focus are committed to covering this year's races with a special series on elections in 2024. And in each of these episodes, we'll zero in on the themes affecting these votes. From economic issues to security, from youth voters to populist movements, we'll be exploring the forces shaping this year's elections.
El Salvador convoca elecciones generales para 2024.
Our first stop is El Salvador, holding the first election of the year in the Americas on February 4th. And despite a technical constitutional prohibition of presidential re-election, Nayib Bukele seems all but guaranteed to win a second consecutive term. The popular millennial president has spent the past 4 years locking in control over Salvadorian politics. Institutions like the Supreme Court that ruled he could run for re-election are filled with allies, and he's used his supermajority in Congress to pass major reforms in the economy and infrastructure, not to mention an ongoing security measure that suspended civil rights in service of a major crackdown on suspected gang members. That policy has proven popular not only in El Salvador, but around Latin America.
Bukele's stance on security, they've sort of set it up as an action to emulate, I guess I could say, or as a guiding post for how leaders should approach crime and corruption in these countries.
That was Roberta Braga, founder and executive director of the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas. Her organization monitors public groups on WhatsApp and Telegram to track online political conversations across the hemisphere. She talked with me about how Bukele and his security strategy are spreading beyond Salvadoreños, and not just to Latin America, but across the world. But first, among the less covered Salvadorian reforms is one that allows people to vote from abroad. With over 2 million Salvadorians living in the United States alone, that could have a major impact on this year's race. Already, in the first 3 days of the 1-month period voters could cast ballots, 10 times as many citizens abroad have voted than did in the last presidential contest in 2019.
And this is something that the Bukele government has put in place because they know they have support from the diaspora. So they have a motivation to make it easier for the diaspora to vote.
That's Michael Parlberg, a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. He spoke to my colleague Chase Harrison about the role of the Salvadorian diaspora in elections, as well as how expat voters could have an impact on other countries' elections, such as Mexico and the Dominican Republic. If you're trying to keep up on Latin America's elections this year, check out the ASCOA Online election guide at as-coa.org/2024. That's where you'll find all the episodes of this Latin American Focus special series, as well as poll trackers and explainers about races taking place across the region this year. And don't forget, share this episode with other election aficionados. Help us spread the word. Write us a review, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast to ensure you hear every episode. In fact, this series might just be the right content to share with your WhatsApp family group.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Michael, welcome to the first Latin America in Focus podcast of 2024.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into our topic today, I wanted to get to know a little bit more about your background. How did you become interested in this question of how diasporic populations abroad participate in the elections of their home countries?
Well, my overall interest in Latin America comes from, as a kid, I lived in Panama. My father was a foreign service officer, so I'm not Latin American myself. I'm Korean American. But I became interested in the region and especially in Central America just from living there at formative age. But as a Washingtonian growing up in the DC region, there's people from every country in the world here, and obviously there's a very large Central American population in the DC metropolitan region. And so I got interested in studying how migrant populations, diaspora communities, have power. And that has implications for the countries they are residing in, but it also has implications for the countries they come from. And a lot of that power comes through the purse, through remittances that they send. And many countries, especially in Central America and the Caribbean, are very dependent on remittances. They make up as much as 20 or 25% of the GDP. So with that economic weight, the diaspora has a serious voice.
No matter where you live in the world, sometimes you see these funny signs of other elections in the world affecting your city. I'm in New York, and every once in a while, I'll see a poster for a political candidate from El Salvador or from Mexico that's doing a rally in Queens or in New Jersey or wherever there's a large migrant population. What are these politicians trying to achieve by doing these rallies in these countries? Like, in an ideal scenario, what is someone who attends one of these rallies going to do afterwards?
Well, my research asked this question, and it asked it in the form of a puzzle, because one interesting thing is a lot of times these politicians come to migrant communities in the US or in other countries, and these migrant communities don't even vote. So they're not necessarily looking for their votes. So my puzzle was, why are they bothering to campaign at a significant expense of both time and money among a largely non-voting diaspora? And this is to say, even for those countries that do offer voting rights to citizens living abroad, most of them still don't do it because it is a logistical hassle. And sometimes, in the case of Mexico famously, they deliberately make it hard for people to vote from abroad because they don't fully trust the diaspora. They think the diaspora is maybe disloyal. They think the diaspora may be too Americanized, or whatever country they happen to be in. Or oftentimes diasporas skew in a particular direction. The reason why it is so difficult for Mexicans abroad to vote, or has been, they did make some reforms. It used to be that they had to register in Mexico. So they had to come back to Mexico just to register to vote. They had to show their birth certificate, and the whole process would take several months. So you couldn't just go there on the holidays and come back. And this is by design, because the long-ruling PRI party knew that there were millions of Mexicans who had left Mexico over the 71-year history that they were in power, and they all distrusted that party. They blamed that party for the conditions that led them to leave. So why would they want them to vote? And there are other cases I contrast in my research. In contrast to other countries, Dominican Republic, this example I use, there's no checks on campaigning abroad, raising money abroad. Political parties have permanent offices in New York, Boston, Florida, wherever there's a significant Dominican community. So that's in terms of the two different poles of diaspora engagement by countries. But it's still the case in both Mexico and the DR that the diaspora doesn't vote that much. Turnout will be for Mexico under 5%, and in the DR it's higher, but it's definitely under 20%. So it's still not a huge number, but the idea for politicians is it's not the votes of the diaspora themselves they're looking for, is the influence that they believe they have. They believe that people who live in the US or in other migrant receiving countries, when they talk to their relatives over the phone, over WhatsApp, whatever, they can tell them how to vote. Now, what's interesting is that's what the politicians believe. Now, I have run statistical models using polling data, and I've found that's not actually true. People in the diaspora do not actually have any impact on how their relatives vote, and they don't actually think they have an impact.
Huh. So it seems still the only tangible way for the migrants to have influence is if they can, in fact, vote from abroad and be franchised. And I think a country that's going to be a fascinating case study in what it looks like when you move from one pole to another in terms of the franchise is El Salvador. You know, in the last presidential election in 2019, I think just under 5,000 Salvadorans voted from abroad because it was a postal model and it was really complicated. But there's a new reform in El Salvador that's making voting from abroad much easier. I saw a statistic that in the 1 month they're giving Salvadorans abroad to vote, in the first 3 days, almost 50,000 Salvadorans cast ballots. That's 10 times more than in the entire 2019 election. So what's going on with this reform? And will this transform the way that the Salvadoran diaspora participates in this election?
Yes, and it already has. As you mentioned, the number of votes transmitted just within a few days has dwarfed the number of votes for any previous election in which the diaspora could vote. This is the first year in which the government, led by President Nayib Bukele, has put in place an online voting system, and it is an experiment, but it is making it much easier for people to vote from home, just online. They just have to take a photo of their ID card called a DUI, DUI, and then they can vote in within minutes. So it's a very quick system. It is not necessarily a very secure system, and many people, civil society actors, especially in the opposition, but also in the U.S., have raised concerns about the lack of transparency of the system and have demanded that there be more oversight over it. And this is something that the Bukele government has put in place because they know they have support from the diaspora. So they have a motivation to make it easier for the diaspora to vote. And this is also part of other reforms that have been going on that have helped President Bukele consolidate power. So one interesting thing about these diaspora votes is they're all going to go to San Salvador, the capital. Salvadoran diasporas do not all come from the capital. In fact, the largest migrant-sending state, which is where I have done most of my research, is in San Miguel. But all of the votes, regardless of where you're originally from, they're going to count for the capital. Why is that? Because the opposition, however weak and little it is, that is where its base of support is in the capital, or in the capital region. So the attempt by Bukele is to swamp this region with votes from his supporters.
Going to events that are trying to attract the diaspora vote, what does it look like on the ground at these kind of events, or when you talk to voters abroad?
Well, one thing that I think is interesting, and this is a somewhat universal phenomenon, is that there is going to be a bit of a divide between the diaspora and the domestic voter. And in the case of countries that went through traumatic conflict, like El Salvador, which went through a 12-year civil war, one of the reputations that many people in the diaspora have with certain generations is that they're kind of still fighting the civil war in their heads, that the civil war is still going on. And it's not entirely fair because obviously people here in the U.S. talk to people there in El Salvador, their home countries, all the time. So it's not like they're not unaware. They're very aware. I've been to campaign events in Northern Virginia where for a mayor, the candidate for mayor of San Miguel came to campaign in Fairfax, Virginia, because there were so many Migueleños living there, and they were grilling him on what is going on the ground in San Miguel, and like what's going on in the local government, because they know. So it's not fair to portray the diaspora as out of touch. They're very in touch.
I'm interested in what you said about the diaspora having large-scale support for Bukele. Are there ways that the diaspora is approaching his ascendancy in El Salvadoran politics, or his controversial approach to questions of security, to questions of cryptocurrency, to questions of state spending, differently than the populations inside the country?
Now, if you believe the polls, and there's reasons to be a little bit suspicious of some polls coming out of El Salvador, given their methodology, but it is clear that the president has strong support from both the domestic population and from the diaspora, and this is largely driven by his security policy, specifically the state of exception. So, as you probably know, since the state of exception, a mano dura policy against gangs has taken place. Over 70,000 people have been arrested arbitrarily without charge, not allowed to see attorneys. And according to government, these are all gang members who are officially legally classified as terrorists. There are many reasons to doubt this number. One former inspector general of the police said that only 30% of those arrested are actually gang members. But there is a sense, both in the country and outside, that the president is doing something about the gang issue, that the country is safer, and they're rewarding the president for this policy. Now, this is by far his most popular policy. Other policies put in place, notably making Bitcoin legal tender, have been much less popular, in fact, quite unpopular. But at this point, the war on the gangs has taken up all the oxygen in the campaign.
You know, this security strategy that Bukele has undertaken is one of the ways that there's talk that there's this Bukele model in Latin America, that leaders from other countries are looking to him as an example for how to do policy in their own country. With everything we've talked about, is there going to be a Bukele model with how to do outreach to diasporas or how to reform vote from abroad policies? Are other countries looking at El Salvador right now?
Well, there are two things to think about in terms of the Bukele model. There's the Bukele model that most people are thinking about, which is the security strategy. And that is something that certainly is being attempted to be copied in many countries. Now, when it comes to the diaspora vote part, an important thing to understand about President Bukele is he's a very skilled publicist. I mean, this is his background. He was a businessman. When I was living in El Salvador, I lived across the street from his Yamaha dealership, which he ran. So I've seen his rise through his career. And he was always a very savvy businessman, but his chief business was always public relations. And this has been how he has been able to reach the diaspora directly through Twitter and Facebook and other social media. He's able to use the power of image, like all of the prisoners who he's shackled in their underwear and paraded before the cameras. This is a very resonant image with a lot of diaspora voters. And something about those images that's clearly aimed at the diaspora is that they're very scary looking images of people with tattoos all over their bodies, including their faces, with a giant 18 on their face or a giant MS on their face. Now, I've been in gang territories in El Salvador, and even as far back as 2015, when murder rates hit their peak, that was actually the peak year of homicides, you did not see people with face tattoos on the street. This is an older generation of the gangs who eventually realized that it's kind of hard to be undercover if you have a giant 18 on your face. Now, of course, there's reasons why they made people have those tattoos, which is it marks you as a pariah forever, and you can only ever work for the gang. So the people who are in prison who look like this, they were not people recently arrested under the state of exception. These are middle-aged people who were arrested 15, 20 years ago. But these are the people who were extorting the diaspora because the diaspora left 15 or 20 years ago or more. So these are the people they remember. And this is a very resonant image with them. Oh, good, the president is doing something about this problem. Well, the people he's showing, they're no longer a problem. So this is just an example of how savvy, but also disingenuous the government has been about using imagery to bolster support for the state of exception and, by extension, his own government.
That's interesting. I mean, Bukele pitches himself as sort of a new generation of Salvadoran leadership, but you just talked about the ways in which he's using these old motifs and these old narratives to promote his political agenda. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the Latin America in Focus podcast. You've given us so much to chew on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks very much for joining me.
That was Michael Parlberg, a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. As he mentioned, one of the major ways Bukele communicates with the diaspora is through social media. In the next segment, we delve deeper with Roberta Braga of the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas, and a conversation not just about Bukele's social media influence, but how online groups are connecting across the Americas to reaffirm hardline security strategies and right-wing beliefs. Her organization draws its insights using a social listening tool that analyzes nearly 700 groups using Spanish or Portuguese as primary languages, with the goal of understanding trends and narratives shaping public discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. And just to start off, we're going to be talking today about El Salvador, and some of the tools that you've been using. Can you tell me a little bit about the tool DDIA has been using to monitor groups and what kinds of information you're seeing, in particular in the case of El Salvador and the country's politics and elections?
Sure. So our research team at DDIA uses a variety of tools to monitor all major social media platforms. We do some narrative analysis work, but we are specifically in partnership with an organization based out of Brazil called Pulver that enables us to analyze public WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups. And this is essentially a social listening tool. It opened up a big world for us. We no longer have to manually connect to public WhatsApp groups and manually look at what's being said. We're able to use keyword searches, image searches, and video searches, as well as audio searches to get a sense of the conversations that are happening in these public groups. And we're currently monitoring over 600 public groups. And about 559 of those 600 groups contain 50% or more US-based phone numbers. And so in that sense, we know that they are both US and Latin America-based groups. And all of these 600 plus groups also use Spanish and Portuguese as a primary language of communication. And so we've deemed these groups to be Latino public WhatsApp groups.
Okay, great. So these are for all across the Americas, these groups. I want to talk a little bit in particular about what you're seeing with the groups that you're monitoring for El Salvador. What kind of things are you seeing when you look at groups that in particular are focused on El Salvador's elections and that are in Salvadoran WhatsApp and Telegram groups? What kind of topics are coming up right now?
So our research consultants are looking at these public WhatsApp groups every day, but our research ran a query from December 15th through January 15th for the name Nayib Bukele to see what would come out. And we found 152 messages in about 85 groups referencing Bukele. And those communications reached, to give you a sense, about 437,000 people. And from these conversations, we can see that there is high international interest in the Salvadoran president. That's pretty clear. And it's clear even among non-Spanish speaking countries like Italy and the United States. Our analysis showed that 8 of the 10 most shared posts on WhatsApp and Telegram in this time period had videos depicting Bukele in a positive light, so a positive sentiment. And in these spaces, we see both some solid support for Bukele's more heavy-handed, zero-tolerance policies against crime, but we also see some coordination among the far right-wing movement, which isn't that unusual. We see that almost in all social media. We've detected some messages reporting supposed meetings and phone calls between Bukele, Milei, Noboa, and the U.S. far right.
Congratulations to Javier Milei on a great race for president of Argentina. The whole world was watching, and I am very proud of you.
And those conversations are about Maine's judicial decision of leaving Trump out of the ballots. Some of them reference Bukele being publicly critical about this decision. And then they also reference these supposed efforts among these different presidents and leaders in the region to create a pro-Donald Trump coalition of support coming from Latin America.
Okay, wow. Sorry, I just have to pause for a second.
I hope that's a good reaction.
I'll continue after that jaw-dropping answer. That's a lot of incredible information, Roberta. And I do want to pause here because we know that ever since Nayib Bukele became president, he's always been framed as this hugely influential leader on social media, as sort of this new model of having social media influence. We know that even in his first appearance at the UN General Assembly, he famously took a selfie.
Solo un segundo, si me permiten. Créanme, muchas más personas verán esa selfie que las que escucharán este discurso. Espero que haya salido bien.
So there were a lot of eyes on him in terms of how he was going to wield that power. And some of the information you're giving us, you're talking about all of these sort of international connections. one of the things that I find interesting about Bukele is that he is so influential beyond even El Salvador in terms of social media. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Can you give us an idea of Bukele's influence globally in social media? And if you can hone in a little bit on what it means for El Salvador's diaspora, how he might use that to reach out to Salvadorans worldwide.
Sure. So Bukele has really doubled down on a strategic communications tactic that we've seen playing out in a variety of different elections now, which is he harnesses and invests in high quality, evergreen, long form and short form video.
Este 4 de febrero debemos proteger los logros en seguridad.
And he uses that in places where people are consuming information. So, for example, on TikTok, on YouTube, and on Instagram. And so that investment in video content, combined with his use of fun, sort of friendly and engaging, personable content, does kind of make him an infotainer at times, you could say.
The man responsible for bringing the 72nd Miss Universe competition to the Central American paradise. Please put your hands together for President Bukele!
And so I think that engagement strategy is growing. I think it's something that we're likely to see more in different elections in the region. It's something we saw in Argentina with Milei.
AKA El Loco, the madman, El Peluca, the wig, or General ANCAP, the cosplay alter ego, depending on...
And so he is kind of making himself available for people who are digitally engaged. And I think that's very compelling. And that's a trend that I think will be growing a lot in the next few years.
I do want to talk a little bit about what this means in terms of information, media literacy, what sort of information people are consuming as they go to vote. You know, we're going to have elections in El Salvador in February. We often think of fact checking as being about correcting misinformation. So someone who's a candidate is sharing some false information and it gets corrected in a speech or something like that. Debunking myths. But when you're talking about the kind of influence that someone like Bukele has, like, so as I understand it, he has more followers on TikTok than there are inhabitants of El Salvador, right?
That's right. He has 7 million TikTok followers in a country of 6 million people. So that gives you a sense of his influence online.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so when we think about that, rethinking what misinformation means when we're talking about people who have such global influence. So we understand that there's the aspect that's bots and misinformation potentially being spread by bots. But is this changing the way that people think about misinformation and fact checking?
Well, yes and no. So I think an important point to make here is that disinformation is not new and it's not a standalone issue. It's a symptom and a byproduct of a larger crisis of trust and also of a societal shift in how we consume and engage with information online. And so we've seen a shift away from consumption of reputable traditional journalism, and we've also seen an oversaturation of these sort of sometimes irreputable, hyper-partisan quote-unquote news and content creators in places where Latinos consume information. So on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram. Our research shows that 47% of Latinos in the US, for example, use YouTube as a source for news and information, often in a typical week. And about half of Latinos in the US use WhatsApp, so more than any other ethnic or racial group in the country. And that gives you a sense of where people are and who they might be engaging with for their news and information, including who they might be trusting as messengers to convey those pieces of information to them.
For us in this interview, you made a lot of connections between different global leaders and how in these groups people are making those connections. We're talking about connections between Donald Trump, between Javier Milei, between Nayib Bukele. We're talking about a potential for within these groups a lot of misinformation to be spread or influencing of messaging. I'm curious, what are some of the ways that people can debunk myths in groups like that? What are some of the strategies to fight misinformation in those groups?
So I think the first thing that you have to understand is that there are some misconceptions, I think, in our minds about who we think see and believe disinformation. A lot of people assume that it's low information, low education voters who would see and believe disinformation. But our public opinion research actually found that it's people who are highly, highly politically engaged, who take politics into their identity, and who are often college educated and affluent, who both see more and believe more disinformation. And so I think that really has consequence for how we look at countering strategies. For example, it is really a whack-a-mole way to look at it if we think about debunking specific claims all the time. I think that fact-checking has a really important role to play, but not for everyone who's seeing and believing disinformation. Fact-checking may not move a lot of these people who have values ingrained into their identity that may lead them to see and believe some false narratives. I think what we have to focus on oftentimes is on master narratives and then tactics and techniques. And what I mean by that is master narratives, so bigger stories that people tell about the world, they often don't change that often. The claims that underpin those stories may change, but the stories themselves may not. And so an example of that is mistrust in media as a master narrative that we've seen in elections since 2018. Election fraud is something that's been kind of embedded into the master narrative space since 2016. Anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, hate, divisive rhetoric against specific communities and immigrants, for example. And so I think that when we're talking about countering, we have to counter those master narratives, not necessarily all of these smaller specific claims. And then on the tactics and techniques side of things, I think it's important for people to become increasingly aware of and resilient to identifying those tactics and techniques. So for example, disinformers might use a lot of emotional manipulation to get you to feel a certain way about information. They might use false dichotomies to try to convince you. So that means, oh, you're either with me or you're not with me. And so it's things like that that I think we need to focus on when we're thinking more about countering at scale. And while fact-checking is incredibly important, it needs to be combined with these other bigger strategies, because otherwise we get caught in this process of being very reactive to specific things. And that is very hard then to scale.
I want to take a moment to bring this back to El Salvador and back to what's, the election that's coming up. Are there certain narratives that you're seeing about the election in El Salvador in these groups? And thinking in this context of sort of the overarching themes, are those themes that you're seeing for El Salvador similar to other themes you're seeing in other parts of the Americas?
We do see some similar narratives playing out. Oftentimes these narratives are very cyclical and borderless. In El Salvador's electoral context, inside these public WhatsApp groups that we've been monitoring during this time period, we actually haven't seen a lot of what we would expect around election fraud or discussions like that. What we do see in this case is support for the security measures that Bukele takes. That's not disinformation necessarily, right? It might be one-sided communication, it might be uncontested narratives, but it's not always disinformation. And that sort of stance on security issues we do see playing out in some other countries in the region. We saw a bit of that around Bolsonaro in Brazil, and we're seeing that in Ecuador as well. So Bukele's stance on security, they've sort of set it up as an action to emulate, I guess I could say, or as a guiding post for how leaders should approach crime and corruption in these countries. And that's a lot of what we're seeing around Bukele is that piece of it, the crime, the security. We haven't yet seen some of these other narratives that we would expect to see and that we've seen in other elections. That doesn't mean we won't in the next few weeks, and we'll keep monitoring those things. But at least for now, what we see more of is just support for certain policies and approaches that he takes.
I want to ask one last question that I want to sneak in. I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot with this one, but there are a number of elections happening in the region. So we've got El Salvador is the first one, where we're going to be having elections in the Dominican Republic, in Panama, in Mexico, where there's where security is a huge issue, but we're not seeing necessarily in the public dialogue the same things that we're seeing in terms of in Ecuador or in El Salvador. We've got Uruguay later in the year. We're probably going to have a Venezuelan election. What sort of things are you seeing around some of these elections and discussions in groups that you've been monitoring? Have you been seeing specific topics that are relevant to a specific country? Like in Panama, are you seeing something different than in the Dominican Republic and different in Mexico?
That's a great question. So I think the way that we can segment those conversations out using Pulver is by looking at what percentage of phone numbers are based in which countries. It's hard to say that a specific conversation is happening in a specific country because oftentimes inside of these groups, we'll see people from a variety of different countries in the region. But we do see spurts of certain conversations. So, for example, when Bukele inaugurated the library in El Salvador, we saw a big spike in conversation around this moment in time, the library, oh, how great it was, a public service. And we also see things playing out from the US to the region. So around certain investigative moments in the Donald Trump cases, we see conversations. We see conversations when states removed him from the ballot in Maine, in the West Coast. We saw conversations happening around that. When the elections happened here in the United States, we saw those playing out in Brazil. When the insurrections happened in both countries, we saw people having conversations about those insurrections in public WhatsApp groups. And we often see people using examples of things that happen in one country to justify actions that are happening in another country. So, for example, something specific. In the Brazilian election, there was a lot of conversation around electoral fraud. It was a close race. We saw commentators and infotainers in Argentina commenting on that. We saw people talking about the election having been stolen from Donald Trump in the US and that having been supposedly repeated in Brazil. And so we see a lot of interconnection between conversations. Of course, a lot of it is context specific, but the point I would make here is that this is no longer isolated to one country or the other. And so when how we think about countering disinformation, there's no use in us focusing on one silo or one context only. I think we have to approach this problem from a larger perspective. And that is part of why DDIA focuses on the Americas and not just on Latinos in the United States or people in the region. We want to be able to connect both how we measure the challenge, but also how we approach the solutions and bring those two worlds together, because really that is how things are happening now. There is no, this only happens here and not here.
That's fascinating. It is a complete rethinking of information sharing, where we so often are looking at information based on what's happening in a particular location or state or country, when this is something that is more amorphous and bigger than that. Roberta, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It was really great to have you and to learn about the work you're doing and how we should be looking at this in a big election year in the Americas.
Thank you so much, Carin. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Carin Zissis. This episode was produced by our executive producer, Luisa Leme, and with support from Jon Orbach. Throughout the year, get content on Latin America's elections through our guide at as-coa.org/2024. The music in this podcast was recorded by C4 Trio for America's Society. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America's Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. You can access other episodes of Latin America in Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast and send us feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.